How content are you? A little? A lot? Sometimes you are and sometimes you aren't? The fact that we all have different answers to that question just shows how elusive the answer to the contentment conundrum remains for we humans. I've never met someone who said that being more content didn't appeal to them at all. And if contentment was easy, we would have nailed it by now. In this episode, we're going to uncover some of the key reasons that contentment eludes us and what to do about them. With any luck, we're going to get a lot closer to cracking the code on the contentment conundrum. This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. The contentment conundrum comes up a lot in my line of work, whether in one-on-one coaching settings or in group settings like graveyard group masterminds. In fact, I want to dedicate this episode to the OG TGG, as we call it, the group of guys who came together for the first ever graveyard group mastermind 2 years ago. I'm a player coach in that group. It's where I do my own mortality-minded work to become the man I'm made to be and live the life I'm made to live. We're still going strong, and a couple weeks ago, another discussion around contentment gave me the inspiration for this episode. Thanks, guys, for your camaraderie and your commitment to leaving it all out on the field of life. First, let's define what we mean by contentment. For today's purposes, we'll call contentment an overall sense of satisfaction and well-being that's based in reality and not dependent upon circumstances. There may be other ways to describe or define it, but it's this kind of contentment that we're chewing on today. Secondly, let's touch on what we don't mean by contentment. We don't mean brainless bovine contentment, out of touch with and unaffected by real life and the real world, like a cow grazing in a field as the world swirls around them. There are at least a couple of ways to achieve this kind of contentment, this counterfeit of the real thing. One of them involves self-destructive use of substances or other reality-escaping practices. Another involves simply living in a chronic state of denial. In my opinion, neither of those end well or bring our best into the world. And if you've tuned in to even just a few episodes already, then you know that in my book, that's a terrible tragedy, both for the liver of the life and the world they inhabit. Paradoxically, although the first definition of contentment requires more commitment and courage, it yields a bumper crop over time, while the second ultimately requires more desperate measures to maintain against the constant encroachments of reality upon its borders, and, in the end, yields a harvest of mediocrity at best and ruin at worst. My strong hunch, though, is that if you're listening to this podcast, you're much more interested in the first definition of contentment. So, let's get to it. All right, I've got a surprise for you. It's a welcome surprise for me. I guess it's not a surprise since technically I came up with it. But anyway, I have a surprise for you. For this episode, it's not going to be a solo as usual. I was thinking about this topic and how I wanted to approach it and realized that I really wanted to have a conversation more than I wanted to just share thoughts in the usual solo episode way. And since I had such a great time recently doing it in the way we're going to do it today and had such a good time with the person that I invited to join me, and because that person happens to live in my house and can't get away from me, and many of you said that you enjoyed our conversation, I've invited my wife, Karis, to join me again for this conversation around the contentment conundrum and cracking the code. Hi, wifey.
Hi.
She's back.
I'm back.
And thankfully, the first time she did it wasn't too painful for her. I think you even said you enjoyed it a little bit, right?
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yep.
And a lot of folks said that it was fun to hear us just riffing on a part of our story that has some big implications for us and then some transferable lessons for all of us. So I thought, let's try this again. And hopefully, as happened in that first episode, we'll tease out some more meaning from this topic of contentment than I'm able to bring out on my own, just in the exchange between the two of us. You didn't know when we started our little business, IET Group Inc., and in the articles of incorporation, you were named CFO, that in other duties as assigned would be included this participating in your husband's podcast, right? Well, here you are. And unfortunately, you're good at it, so you're going to have to deal with that. So I'm going to just get the conversation kicked off around the contentment conundrum, and it's organized basically in two major headings. And I'll start with the first one and tease that one out a little bit, and then we'll move on to the second one. And the first heading that I want to put into this conversation is this statement: contentment can't be found by looking for it. So as we are attempting to crack the code for ourselves on the contentment conundrum, this is the piece I think that we first have to realize and really come to grips with if we haven't already, that contentment can't be found by looking for it. In fact, the more intent I think we become on finding it, the more elusive it becomes. It's like trying to hold on to an eel. And I realize that maybe is a weird analogy, and some of you haven't ever done that before. When I was a little boy at the beach, we would fish off the dock, and sometimes we'd leave our rod in the water just to see what would grab it while we were in having lunch or something. And I would come back, and very often, for some reason, there would be an eel on the line, and it had wrapped itself around the pilings of the dock, and eventually we'd get it up. And man, those things are so slimy and so muscular and so wriggly that it's when you try to grab it, and the harder you try to grab it, it just squirts out of your hand. And so that may or may not jive with you. Maybe you never held an eel and don't ever wish to, but that really is sort of what like contentment can be when we try to find it. It becomes more and more slippery, or it's like a mirage. You're always traveling toward it, but never reaching it. Or like mistaking the good times that we have in the car on a road trip for the purpose of the trip, because good times in the car on a road trip are a byproduct of traveling to a destination and not the sole purpose of the trip. Now, I think this is self-evident, and I'm speaking as one who has spent a lot of my life seeking contentment. And the more I sought contentment for its own sake, the more elusive it became. And as I pondered that, I realized that I think there's just a broader truth in that applies to all of us. And some of the ways that modern men and women attempt to find contentment are through things like yoga and meditation and other self-care practices that frankly are really valuable and important. And it's really good to have good self-care practices. But the mistake we make is believing that these self-care practices will in and of themselves create contentment. And I think this misunderstanding leads to a lot of anxiety and frustration and even anger as we double down on those practices and they don't give us what we want. Some of the folks I know who engage in these practices the most intently are paradoxically often sometimes some of the tensest, most tightly wound people. And I think part of that is because they're trying to use something to achieve something that it was never meant to provide for them, because those practices don't create contentment in and of themselves. Instead, and this is important, I think, they cultivate conditions within me that allow me to engage life in all of its complexity, highs and lows, victories and defeats, triumphs and tragedies, even better equipped to handle those things. So those self-practices are part of our maintenance. They help us show up to the game of life, the battle of life, better prepared, but they don't in and of themselves create contentment. And when we think they will, we're really on a fool's errand, in my opinion. And it can produce the opposite: anxiety, anger, frustration, those kinds of things. I've mentioned on Instagram, and some of you may have seen it, but I recently went on my first ever personal retreat, and Karis was kind to give me 3.5 days over a weekend away. So she had our two wild bundles of joy and energy, our two boys, on her own for the weekend. And I just went north of town here to a little retreat center in the mountains. I had 3.5 days of retreat. And honey, in what condition did I return? And you can be totally honest.
The first day, you were energized. As an introvert, when you have a lot of time to yourself, you become more talkative and chatty. You had lots of ideas and thoughts floating around that you had come up with on the retreat. So that was Monday. And then I would say by Wednesday, you were a little bit of a mess.
So a mess how? Be specific.
Well, all of those thoughts and ideas came to a point of maybe having to make decisions on them or moving forward with them or what you're not going to do anymore. Sometimes just freezes you up a little bit, which makes you less chatty and energetic and a little more complex.
Yeah. Good description and fair. And that was kind, even, I would say, like in the way you described it.
Well, you're not a mess like you're a monster or
Right.
anything. It's an internal
Yes.
jumbled up feeling for you.
That's right. And I bring that up to say that, that retreat was really an extended form of meditation for me, where I really let myself be how I wanted to be, do what I wanted to do. And during that time, the questions that really needed attention bubbled to the surface in my life. And I began to work on answers to some of those questions. And the value of the retreat was at least in part the fact that I got away from all of the other quote questions that the world feeds us on a daily basis, whether it's through our inbox or even podcasts like this one, or from coworkers and bosses. And just the world is always, in one way or another, posing questions to us that can lead us to believe that we need to answer them. I've got more emails. I've got, gosh, this guy or gal over here is doing it this way. Maybe I should do it that way. A question we might pose to ourselves by comparison to others. And the retreat certainly was a form of meditation because it allowed me to get clear on which questions needed attention more than others and begin to answer them. And then I came back from a literal and figurative mountaintop to a literal and figurative valley and began to live in the main current of my life once again, which involves my wife and my boys and clients and all the other things that life involves on the best of days, not to mention other things that come along that are unexpected and external to us. And the complexity emerges again.
I think some of the value in the messiness it can sometimes create in the aftermath, though, is sometimes bringing that clarity to the things that do bring you life and energy. That's generally much clearer. And then the things that you're finding to be more of a drag or a little harder to re-enter or to face again is maybe clarity in, maybe I need to adjust that part of my life, or maybe this goal that I've got is no longer in line with what I do want to do. So I think that mess can be real valuable as long as you don't just see it as a jumbled up mess, that it's doing the work that the retreat was for.
That's a perfect point. And it ties into something we'll talk about here in a few minutes, just about the value of discontentment. So I'm glad you brought that up because, the mess, how we relate to that mess when it comes up determines what it will do in our lives. Mm-hmm. And if we immediately resent the fact that, gosh, I'm back in the valley and it's messy, then I don't reap the full benefit of having to merge my mountaintop and my valley. And that's where the magic happens, is when, I go away, we do whatever, we have some insight, and then we want to merge that in real time into our lives. Well, that's not just a plug and play. Typically, to put something new in our lives, we're removing something else, or we're modifying something that was there. Love that point. So the retreat itself didn't create contentment. In fact, in some ways, I was a little bit more of a mess than I might have been had I not gone away. But the retreat gave me an opportunity to re-enter my life and to change some things that in time I really do believe will yield greater levels of contentment. But it's a little bit counterintuitive the way it happens. So just to close out this first section, I really think contentment can't be found by looking for it. It's one of those paradoxes like Joe Harcel brought up in his episode that, if something doesn't appear to be true, then it can be one of three things. It's either a paradox. It was, I know I wouldn't remember on the spot. Oh, well, I'll keep moving. Anyway, it's one of those paradoxes. A paradox is not untrue, but we just don't understand it. So the first bit of code to crack in the contentment conundrum is getting over the idea that we can find contentment by looking for it. Then once we're over that idea, we can move on to understanding and acting on the things that actually do produce contentment. So that's the first kind of broad heading in this conversation. And the second one follows up on that first one, and it's this, that I believe we can experience contentment as we persevere in becoming the person we were made to be and living the life we were made to live. And of course, if you've tuned into this podcast more than once, you've heard me say that multiple times. So let me say it again. Rather than seeking contentment for its own sake and thinking we'll find it, I believe we experience contentment as we persevere in becoming the person we were made to be and living the life we were made to live. And I think there's at least 5 key ingredients in the recipe for becoming the person we were made to be and living the lives we were made to live. And I'll list them here and then we'll go through them one by one. And I'm under no illusion that we're knocking the ball out of the park or giving it some full comprehensive treatment for contentment, but we're certainly going to do our best to make a big dent today. So the 5 ingredients in the recipe that I want to propose to all of us is, number 1, connection with a higher power. Number 2, finding and traveling our unique path in life with guts, gusto, abandon, and purpose. Number 3, cultivating positivity. 4, practicing presence and possession. And 5, making people our priority. So we'll go through these in more detail, but just really quickly, I think this recipe yields genuine contentment, much like an exquisite meal yields amazing flavor and warmth in our belly. It's not the meal itself, but it's an awesome and welcome byproduct of it. And I also think this kind of contentment, genuine, deep, abiding contentment, comes with scars and wounds picked up in the battle of life. This isn't that bovine contentment thing we talked about before. In fact, this kind of contentment is possible at least in part because of the scars and wounds acquired in the battle of life. We mistake freedom from suffering, stress, and hardship as a source of contentment, when in fact those are some of the most important ingredients in the recipe for living a life that produces contentment along the way. So the first point, connection with a higher power. And this, it's again, if you've tuned into more than one episode, then you probably know kind of where I'm coming from on the spiritual side of things, and that, I really do believe there is an intelligent, benevolent creator behind all of this that we experience in life. And it's not important that you agree with me on that, and I'm not here to try to convince you of that. That debate has been raging for eons. As long as humans have been walking the planet, we've been having that debate. But what I want you to at least consider today is connection with the higher power to mean a source of satisfactory answers for life's 3 big questions. And Rob Rigg in episode 18, who's the coroner here in Routt County, brought these 3 big questions to my attention. And then in episode 20, my guest Matt Wilkes doubled down on these. That wasn't intentional. It was coincidental or providential, however you want to look at it. And these 3 questions, I agree with Rob and Matt, that I believe that these questions reside in the heart of every man and woman and demand attention. They're hardwired into how we're made. And those 3 questions are, number 1, where did I come from? Number 2, how do I get the most out of this life while I'm here? And then 3, what happens when I'm gone? What happens after this earthly life? And as I've said, I think these questions exist in the hearts of every man and woman, and they demand attention. And I think evidence of the universality of these questions lies in the very fact that humanity has been grappling with them for as long as we've been around, and unable to reach satisfactory agreement or make the questions simply go away. And I think we've been trying really hard for a really long time. In one way or another, these questions take up a central place in our collective human story, whether in our persistent attempts to answer them, in our persistent attempts to ignore them, or anywhere in between.
I think those are such hardwired questions that even our young children are asking them.
Yeah.
Which I think it behooves us to stop and really listen to the questions that children are asking, because I think we've all asked them in our heart. But like you say, as you continue on with life, we do just try to kind of make them go away if we don't really have an answer for it. And rather than being concerned we don't have an exact answer for the kids, just continuing to let them explore that and continue to think about it, as we should too.
Yeah, one of the very first phrases I uttered on this podcast was a quote from our now 11-year-old son, McGray, who at dinner one evening said, "Death brings meaning to life." And after we picked our jaws up off the floor, we kind of inquired as to what he meant by that. And we had never planted that idea in his mind. And he doesn't talk much about stuff like that anyway.
Right.
But he just came out with it because somehow in the middle of that conversation, it made sense and it connected some dots for him. And he was at the time 9 or 10?
10, I think.
10. So, a 10-year-old kid, you wouldn't normally necessarily think they're thinking about that kind of thing. And we'd never planted that idea in his mind, but lo and behold, he comes out with it.
Right.
So in my opinion, we don't have to wonder whether or not these questions are rumbling around in our hearts and minds or in other people's hearts and minds. It's just a matter of what are we doing with them? How much attention are we giving them? And in my opinion, too, when we work hard to ignore the nagging persistence of these questions, it actually leads to worse consequences than going ahead and giving it attention. Because if these questions are there and demand attention from us, we can spend a whole life trying to ignore those questions and make them go away and make their volume go down. And we can do that through a lot of creative ways. It can be keeping ourselves busy. It can be using alcohol or drugs to kind of numb ourselves to the persistence of those questions. It can be any number of things. We're good at avoiding things we don't want to deal with. but they don't go away.
And it requires a lot of energy and attention to exactly what you're trying to get rid of, which is taking away from so many wonderful things in life to be putting that time and energy into, even if it's just embracing the mystery.
Yeah.
Like Joe said.
Yeah. We don't like mystery, and we don't like having to ask some of these big questions. We'd like to just kind of continue to crank on. But if 2020 and the whole COVID situation has taught all of us collectively anything, it's that life can change in the blink of an eye. And we may be able to sort of ignore some of these nagging questions for a time, but tragedy, crisis comes to all of us someday. Who was it that, Allison Cheney in one of the early episodes, one of the big takeaways for me from that conversation was she said, it's really no use sitting around and wondering in what form our troubles and crises are going to come, because they're going to come. It's just a matter of when and in what form. And in the meantime, live your life. And so it's not whether crises are coming, it's a matter of just when and how. And so we really do ourselves a service in terms of, again, continuing to find contentment in life by going ahead and grappling with these questions and trying to wrestle them to the ground. And each of us has to wrestle them to the ground in our own way and in our own time. But don't ignore these questions, because they don't go away. And because they don't go away, and because I'm proposing that they are hardwired, then number one on this list of living a life that yields the kind of contentment that we all want is finding satisfactory answers to those three big questions. And of course, Karis and I and our family, we do that through connection with God, through ways that are available to us, through prayer and the Bible and other ways of in fellowship with other people. And that helps us answer those questions. Any thoughts on that before I move on, other than what you already added, honey?
No.
All right, the second point, the second ingredient in the recipe for becoming the person we were made to be and living the lives we were made to live in order to then experience the contentment that's available to us in life is finding your path and traveling with guts, gusto, abandon, and purpose. And I use this language a lot on this show. And this is an ongoing process, not a one and done. It is, in very simple terms, a process of having an insight, applying action to that insight, experiencing some transformation as a result, and then repeating. I mean, that's a huge oversimplification of what life is actually like, but I think if you boil it down to its basic elements, that's what's happening for all of us, or at least that's the opportunity that all of us has in life, is to learn and then to do something what we learn, to experience the change that results, and then do it again. And I think some people are able to find their path and walk it with guts, gusto, abandon, and purpose pretty organically and naturally. I can think of a few people right now that I know who at least seem to have done that fairly organically and naturally. That's not to say it hasn't involved a lot of hard work, but they seem to have come easily into that kind of a mindset. And I think it's a function of innate wiring, the nature part, and an especially fertile developmental environment growing up. That's the nurture part. So I think nature and nurture are involved, but others sometimes require a bit more intention and deliberate work to discern their path. That would certainly be true of me. And there's been a lot of pain that has come along with trying to understand who I am and what I do in this world. It's a false distinction to say either you're one way or the other, but whichever of those is more like you, no matter how we come at understanding the unique path we have in life and walk it with guts, gusto, abandon, and purpose, there are at least a couple things that I think are really critical to finding our path. And one is an increasing depth of self-knowledge, that we are consciously compiling an owner's manual for the kind of human that we are. I like this analogy between me and Karis. You know, as I've kind of developed my own owner's manual, I've come to see myself as like a 76 Land Cruiser. It's not going to drive down the interstate very quickly. If you put it on a racetrack, it wouldn't beat a Ferrari. But if you put it on a mountainside and told it to go from the bottom to the top, it probably will get there. It might not be pretty. It'll be a windy road, but it'll keep going. And that's kind of how I feel like I navigate life and what it's taken for me to find my path in life. Now, conversely, honey, I would say you're a Ferrari.
Really?
You just can think circles around me. I mean, how often do I come to you and say, I'm stuck on this? And you go, well, you need to X. And it's so self-evident to you. And I've been stuck on that thing forever. And there's plenty of data to back up just, that you have a rocket ship for a brain. You've got rocket fuel that you're able to feed into it. And I mean, you can just crank out so much work on a daily basis. You can keep so many things in your head all at once. And thankfully, the two of us have been able to use tools together like Myers-Briggs assessments, natural ability battery, things that have helped us to more quantitatively and qualitatively understand the kinds of humans that we are. And you were mentioning before we got on and started recording, like your real estate journey. Mm-hmm. Would you share a little bit about that and how, your deepening levels of self-knowledge have led you forward professionally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about it when we were revisiting our company, IAT, Insight, Action, Transformation. I'd been working in the real estate business with my mom for a few years, just as an admin assistant, which is the type of role that I love. I've done that all of my life, had a little bit of schooling for it, but through experience, became pretty proficient at it and was very comfortable in that role because I knew what I was doing. As we continued in the real estate business together, I started seeing the value of me getting my license to really help grow our business and allow me to take on a lot more. But for me, the fear of having to study and take a test just completely blocked that opportunity for me because I don't like traditional learning. School was never a fun experience for me. I've always been very hands-on and show me how and then I'll do it. But realizing this is something that could be really great for me and could really advance my career, and just really learning how to do things that are scary, but then finding tools to help you get through those hard times. So I met with the wife of the coach that Andrew has worked with to do some natural ability battery testing and through Myers-Briggs and stuff like that, just to learn more about myself and figure out, why is this part hard for me? Why am I so scared to do it? And just understanding that a lot of my wiring, it just doesn't function the way that traditional schooling does. So through that, finding some great tools and tips on how to approach that schooling differently gave me just a renewed sense of, oh, I can do this. It's just going to look different than what someone else does. And so I just busted into it, had 2 young kids at home, which was also extremely daunting, trying to figure out when to get the schooling in. And it was still really hard. It was not a fun process. I did not all of a sudden enjoy reading books and watching instructional videos. That was still all just a discipline and something I knew I had to do to get to the end. We'd been talking a lot about affirmation through that too. And so I was doing a lot of affirming and how I was going to do on the test and what that was going to do for my future. And so the insight was I was scared of it, figuring out why am I scared of it? What do I do to approach that differently so that I focus on what I can do rather than what I don't want to do or what I'm not good at? And then the action of then just doing it, just moving forward, starting it. And the transformation for me was realizing, gosh, I'm not dumb, which is often how I felt because I didn't do great in school and I didn't like it. And I don't learn quickly from reading a textbook. But through the test and passing it just fine with a good grade or score, whatever, and coming out of it realizing, gosh, I learned a lot. I actually do know a lot. And now I'm even better at my job. And so I think the transformation for me was just giving me that confidence of I can do whatever I put my mind to. Sometimes I just have to find a different way to do it than how someone else does it.
That's a huge deal to go from considering yourself dumb in a certain way to being able to understand that, oh, I just operate differently. And now if I operate myself this way in the world, I can move toward the things that are appealing to me. And I hope some of you out there listening can relate to what Karis is sharing. And I no doubt some of you can. And the traditional schooling environment, the public schools, serves a lot of great purposes, and there's some kids it doesn't serve very well. I was the kind of kid that, man, you throw some information at me and it's going to stick, and I can throw it back out to you on a test plus extra credit.
He still brings up things he learned in 7th grade.
Yeah, and a lot of the information I've still got in my head has no immediate value. And so for me, traditional schooling worked great, but in real life, lacking some common sense sometimes doesn't work so well. And I just love that you've been able to, because you were willing to move towards something that was appealing to you, and it wasn't I don't think, unless I misunderstand, it wasn't because you were like out to get more contentment. You just saw an opportunity that this is the next step on your path. Mm-hmm. There was a hurdle in your way, which was the whole learning challenge that went along with it. When you learn more about the kind of human that you are, and your owner's manual got more detailed and more useful, you were able to move through that challenge toward what you wanted. Mm-hmm. Now, contentment up, contentment down, contentment neutral at that point in taking that advancement professionally and personally.
I think it definitely increased my contentment because, again, it just gave me a little more peace inside of, oh, I can figure that out. I can do this. And so it relieves a little bit of that fear, which then brings so much more freedom when you're not wrapped up in that.
And I mean, as your husband and watching you evolve and all those kinds of things, just see so much more in you that there's a sense that you know who you are and how you're made and what you're here to do in the world. And you understand that, yeah, I could do the administrative assistant stuff, but I'd never conceived of a higher ceiling for myself professionally. And now I think not only do you think, gosh, there is a higher ceiling for me, you realize that if in time you realize this ceiling isn't the highest, then you can bust through that one and make another one. So it's not just that you've achieved a level of excellence in real estate and for yourself professionally, but you've achieved an underlying level of a sense of self-efficacy and self-confidence that, wow, there's more in me than I thought was there.
Yeah, I think part of the insight, too, of also realizing, yeah, there's some areas that I'm not, quote unquote, super smart or get, but there's a lot of other areas that maybe don't have anything to do with intelligence that I've always loved.
Sense.
Right.
Yeah.
But I love people. I love being with people. I love having people in my home and realizing that a lot of my job played into those things that were truly strengths in my life too, because I'm not just there to close a deal. I'm there to walk alongside someone and be with them in this very emotional process of a huge decision. And that's what's more rewarding to me, but also realizing that's a super important thing to have in this type of a business too. And so realizing, oh, I already had a little bit of that naturally. And now I can make that even bigger and better because that goes along with it. And yeah, there's definitely a confidence that you have a better baseline of confidence that then makes a lot of decisions easier because you think, well, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I bet I can figure it out because I did that before.
Yeah. And I've seen you go from, interested enough in development and understanding ourselves from just sort of a nominal interest in it to understanding myself really has a lot of value. It's created this new professional chapter for me. It's allowed me to grow in self-confidence.
Well, it improved our marriage big time too,
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah, you were awful before that.
Right, yeah, till you got me straightened out. But understanding where our differences are and how those can either just be a constant challenge or we can face them and say, okay, how do we make these complement each other rather than always challenge each other?
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, can you imagine if we were both like me and would be always wrapped around the axle about the complexity of life and trying to plumb the depths of meaning and existence and all that kind of stuff?
Or if we were both mean, we'd be fighting where things go in the refrigerator and why you didn't put that back where it belongs.
Yeah, and I've often said that, I typically have my head in the clouds and you have your feet on the ground. And isn't that great? Because your feet connect me to the ground and my head connects you to the clouds where maybe I spend more time dreaming and with a long view and you spend more time executing on the ground. Both are needed. Neither is more valuable than the other. And when we know that about ourselves and then can then value the differences in the other person, our enjoyment of each other goes up. Our sense of valuing each other's lives go up. Our sense of interdependence goes up. And mind you, this is all when we're on our game because we have plenty of moments where we're just doing the normal.
Well, you do.
Right. I have plenty of moments where I'm wrong and you need to help me see that I'm wrong. And then once I see that, we can move on. But I hope these are connecting some dots for you around the idea that deepening our self-knowledge and acting on what we learn is a path to contentment. It's not the destination is self-knowledge, a better owner's manual so we can deploy ourselves better in the world. And the collateral benefit is greater sense of contentment and enjoyment and power in the world. And then another point I wanted to make around finding and walking our own path with guts, gusto, abandon, and purpose is that owning and integrating our story, capital S story, is really critical here. And that includes healing from and using the lessons of past hurts. It includes owning imperfections, some of them caused to us by others, some of them just innately within us, and owning them so that they can become superpowers. I've told this many times in other episodes, talked about how, for me, especially the anxiety that I've hated my whole life, but has been with me my whole life, has also been the source of inspiration for creating the Graveyard Group and this podcast and embracing the power of our mortality to help us become the people we're made to be and live the lives we're made to be. So was the anxiety good or was it bad? Well, probably the wrong question. I mean, there are parts of it that are painful, and there are parts of it that are now bringing a lot of good things into the world that can help other people. And that opportunity hasn't existed until I was willing to stop fighting my story and just turn around and look at it and own it in all of its highs, its lows, its blemishes, and that includes the shameful parts too. And taking responsibility for everything in my story, and then taking responsibility for using every part of my story to lead me onto my unique path. Because I think, as I've said often, our story and our unique path and our unique purpose in the world are absolutely inseparable. And when we try to distance ourselves or jettison or discard our story in some way, we actually are cutting off our noses to spite our faces. We're actually cutting ourselves off from our unique path and our unique purpose. Now, I realize all these things that we're talking about, easy to say, hard to do, but guess what? This is life. This is the path of life, walking it out day in and day out. There are no silver bullets. There are no quick fixes, but there are absolutely ways forward if we're willing to dig in and do the work. And this is some of the work. So deepening your owner's manual, using your owner's manual so you understand your best operating conditions and can engineer your life to suit those as often as possible. Also understanding when you're outside of ideal operating conditions and you can phone a friend, like I get my wife often to say, hey, I'm stuck here. I don't see this. What do you see? And keep moving. And then owning and integrating your story. So enough on that. Let's move on unless you have any other thoughts on that point. Point 3, or ingredient 3 in the recipe for finding and living the life we were made to live. Practicing presence and possession. So first, presence, and there's a lot talked about this these days, is really being present. And of course, it's present in all of the spiritual and philosophical traditions of old. And many of us are working hard for that these days in a world that can sometimes feel like it's coming off the rails. And really, it just means being right here, right now. It's the only place we can be. Again, easier said than done, but we can cultivate being present with practice. There's magic in the mundane moments. And when we are always striving for the next thing, we miss the magic of the mundane moment. Tony Gonzalez in episode 23, a 25-year veteran firefighter, really drove this home to me. And that episode, after his 25 years of just unbelievable experiences in the fire service and now choosing a life for him that prioritizes the mundane moments with his family, really drove home to me the magic of the mundane. And this is where things like yoga and meditation and creative solitude, like I have on my walks or on a retreat, intimate conversations with a trusted friend, washing the dishes with your wife, building Lego sets with your sons or your daughters. This is where those kinds of things really come in handy to teach us the value of presence and can train us to do that. So we have to cultivate that. And then I also said practicing possession. And that may seem counterintuitive because most of the spiritual and philosophical traditions out there talk about impermanence and not being attached to outcomes. So let me clarify what I mean here through a story. I woke up one morning a while ago, and it was in the midst of another little period of angst for me around personal and professional stuff and just what am I becoming and who am I and this, that, and the other, which is very common for me and the kind of human that I am, with a passage of scripture in my head. And that doesn't happen to me very often, even though I do embrace the Judeo-Christian, general approach to life and existence. And so it immediately stuck out to me that, this is unusual. What's this about? This doesn't feel like it really came from me. So let me just chew on it a little bit. And as I chewed on it, I began to connect some dots. And the passage of scripture that came to mind, and this is a rough paraphrase, was basically, whoever has will be given more, and whoever doesn't have, even what he has will be taken from him, using the masculine just in a generic way. And as I chewed on that more, I realized, gosh, in my striving through this personal and professional transition that we've been in the midst of for 8 years, and it's somewhat stabilized, but we're continuing to move onward. I've been pushing so hard for the next thing, whether it was the next zero in our bank account or the next creative endeavor or whatever it was, that it was like in my mind's eye, I could see myself sort of climbing over those things in order to reach the next thing in a way that failed to appreciate those things and really possess them, to have them, to say, gosh, we've gained these things. We've gained this new life. We've gained evolved professions. We've gained greater clarity into who we are. We're fortunate to have health and 2 wonderful boys we enjoy spending time with and a spouse that we enjoy. I was constantly minimizing those things and sort of climbing over them to get to the next thing. So when I say practice possession, I mean practice really having what you have. And it's different than gratitude. I think we can all appreciate the value of having a practice of gratitude and being grateful, but it's also just day by day really having what you have. So that makes sense to me, but I'm going to throw it back to you because I want to know if that makes sense to you.
It does. I think another way I might say it would be enjoying what you have, actually live in what you have and acknowledge it and then go live it.
Yeah.
If you have a wonderful family, take time to go spend time with that family. If you have the ability to travel and you love traveling, embrace that. And along the way, realize this is awesome that I am able to do this. And I think acknowledging it, enjoying it, and really living it intentionally.
Like that, enjoying what you have. And that comes up time and time again in one-on-one coaching and graveyard groups and other conversations just with friends and stuff is, we often just fail to enjoy the fruits of our labors.
I think it also can help avoid a little bit of always wanting more, because if you're actually spending your time and energy enjoying what you have, there's less time to think about what you don't have and what you wish you did have, because there's less empty time.
Yeah. It brings to mind, we've all either seen images of this or actually been to places where this is happening. Kids in impoverished nations laughing out loud, having a blast on a dirty, gravelly playground, chasing a soccer ball that they made out of rubber bands and plastic bags. And, we in the West world might look at that and go, oh, those poor kids, but they're not thinking, oh, poor kids. They're having a blast on the playground playing soccer with a ball that they made. And how does that work? How can that be possible? And I've never lived a moment in their shoes. And so on the one hand, it's ridiculous for me to surmise, but you can at least begin to believe that being present, having what we have, enjoying what we have, living a meaningful life that's full of contentment is not dependent on circumstances. And a mentor of mine used to say, whenever someone would say, under the circumstances, comma, ... he would always quickly say, well, what are you doing under the circumstances? I remember it used to bug the crap out of me, like, come on. I mean, okay, fine, whatever, turn of phrase, play of words. But that's really stuck with me. When we are citing the circumstances as a cause for displeasure, discontentment, whatever it might be, then we are saying those circumstances control my experience of life and my well-being. And if those kids in impoverished nations chasing the ball around can teach us anything, it's that our contentment is not dependent on circumstances if we're willing to accept it. The challenge with being willing to accept that is it means an extreme level of personal responsibility for our well-being that many of us have yet to fully embrace. Mm-hmm. Because it means I'm owning the way I'm thinking. It means I'm owning what I'm doing. It means I am taking, as Jocko Willink says, extreme ownership for everything in my life, regardless of whether it happened to me or I caused it. I always have an option to respond in a particular way. So practicing presence and possession is the third ingredient in this recipe that we're cooking up. The fourth point is cultivating positivity, and I'm not talking about just a good attitude or, faking it till you make it or, smiling until you feel like it on the inside kind of thing. As important as that is, what I'm really talking about here is focusing on who we are and what we can do more often than we focus on who we aren't and what we can't do. And some people, by disposition, the nature part, and by nurture, the upbringing part, are able to do this more easily than others. I certainly am not able to do that by nature or nurture as easily as others might be able to. Be that as it may, no matter where you're coming from, no matter your starting point, and the research bears this out, focusing on who we are and what we can do rather than who we are and what we can't do is a 100% guaranteed recipe for greater contentment in our lives. Karis, you see me very often focused on what I'm not and who I'm not and what I can't do and this, that, and the other. In fact, just yesterday you were commenting that, because I was talking about how I was having lower energy around creating a podcast episode or something. And you said, have you ever noticed that your energy seems to bounce around between the different parts of your professional life? And one minute you're hyped on the podcast, and the next minute you're hyped on Graveyard Group, and then you're hyped on one-on-one coaching. And I was like, oh, yeah, I guess I was kind of aware of that. And that relates, I think, connects somehow to this idea that focusing on who we are and what we can do rather than who we are and what we can't do is a real winner. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that's part of what I learned through some of my insight and action too, is realizing focus on what you can do. And if you think you can't do it, rather than just saying, well, I can't do that, think, well, how could I do that?
Great question.
How could I make it possible for me to do that? And you really don't know what you can do until you try.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe there are things that you go, nope, can't do that. But that doesn't mean there's nothing else.
Right.
Then go find what you can do and what you want to do.
Beautiful. And this also, cultivating positivity, involves developing a bias toward action and positive forward movement. And this is coming from a guy who is all about reflection, ideas, theories, concepts. And then and Karis can attest, as soon as it gets to the point of trying to execute on any of those ideas, what happens?
You freeze.
I hate making decisions. I start to encounter the messy middle where the work gets done to actually execute on those ideas.
And then you question what you've started.
Yeah, I'll get halfway into it. And so I have just become absolutely enamored with this idea of action and positive forward movement. In fact, to the point that one of my truisms in life that I've developed for myself and shared in other places professionally is that if you're stuck, get moving. I mean, and I get stuck often. And I've just learned, I'm doing that stuck thing, so get moving. Sometimes that means making a decision. Sometimes that means going and getting some water. Literally just don't stay stuck, get moving. And Teddy Roosevelt, one of his personal mottos in life was get action. And he was famously always moving forward in his own life. So cultivating positivity, a lot of that is just about taking action, especially just being willing to see the areas where you can move forward and to see who you are instead of who you aren't. Final ingredient in our recipe today is making people our priority. And it's the last, but it's certainly not the least. In fact, I think this one is the bow that ties them all together. There's power and mystery in human connection. And I believe that we're made for relationships with other people. Now, this doesn't mean you have to have a gazillion like some people enjoy. Sometimes it's just one or two meaningful connections and relationships. You know which of those you would prefer. I've been astounded in the Graveyard Group over the past couple of years to see how profound a difference it's made in some people's lives just to be meeting regularly with a group of other guys. We've had guys come into the Graveyard Group who have shared that they live daily in the depths of a deep, dark depression, or that they have significant other mental health challenges, or their marriage is on the rocks, or you name it. And it's not because of anything that I do as a coach. It's not because of anything magical that I say as a coach. It's not a result of anything magical that others do or say in the group. At its essence, I believe why people that come in with those kinds of challenges can just months later feel relatively free of those challenges and have moved through some of those challenges is simply because there is power and mystery in human connection. And you were talking earlier, Karis, about, before we got on to record, about minimally it reduces our sense of loneliness and aloneness.
Yeah, even if there isn't anything powerful, magical, outwardly happening, being in the presence of other people who know that struggle, but still accept you and still just keep showing up. There's something about not being alone.
And you realize, I'm not as crazy as I thought. Other people experience this. Mm-hmm. Or, maybe you realize, I am as crazy as I thought, and other people are too. Mm-hmm. And we heal in that context. The Graveyard Groups are not therapeutic. I'm not a therapist. I don't give out therapy information. I don't hand out prescriptions. But the results in the Graveyard Group are nonetheless therapeutic. And that's because human relationships are therapeutic. And when we isolate ourselves from other people, or in the context of those relationships, hide parts of ourselves from people and don't risk the vulnerability and the courage it takes to be vulnerable, we increase our sense of isolation, even in the midst of a lot of people. And that is a thief of contentment. And so minimally, it breaks the grip of aloneness and loneliness. But more than that, it begins to help us see that, hey, we're all on this rugged, rough, uneven, chaotic, sometimes joyful, sometimes stressful, sometimes triumphant, sometimes tragic journey of life together.
I think sometimes being with people too can pull you out of your own sometimes selfish view of, I'm dealing with this, I'm struggling with this.
Woe is me, yeah.
And then you have a friend who suddenly has a wife in the hospital or is sick or has something happen, and you're able to step up and help that person. There's immense joy that can bring, that just kind of helps break that cycle of everything is about me.
Yeah.
But there's just a real beauty in getting to help care for other people and help them through their times too, which gives you better focus sometimes.
We move from me to we.
Mm-hmm.
And we is a way better place to be.
Yep.
I mean, part of the reason we were willing to risk the changes that we made in our lives, as risky as they felt, and to us, was because we realized we did have a we. We had a we back east in Virginia that were supportive of us and loved us and would do whatever they could to help us in times of need. We had a we out here in Colorado with your family and their friends that we were able to immediately enter community with.
There was something different about the connections we made here, that, not to belittle relationships that we did have where we were before, but I think we did still feel a little sense of loneliness there. There was something that wasn't a true connection. It was like a fabricated kind of thing. And we came here, and I think we were finding the best versions of ourselves, which allowed us to have very different connections and relationships with those that we met here.
Yeah.
Which really does bring different contentment and enjoyment in those relationships and just in life in general.
And that ties back into this piece we'll talk about here in a second that you alluded to much earlier in the conversation around there was this element of discontentment that try as we might, we weren't able to resolve back east, that began to get resolved once we took action in our lives to move toward what we believed was a better life for us. And in the process of that, began to create friendships and professional engagements and a variety of things that began to reduce that level of discontentment and increase our level of contentment. So good point. That's true. So, and in my worldview, again, from my spiritual end of the swamp, genuine, durable contentment always involves vibrant connections with people, because that's how we're made. And when we ignore how we're made, it'd be like me trying to drive my Land Cruiser on a racetrack against a Ferrari. I mean, technically it'll go and get around the track, but not well. And I could burn up the engine trying to redline it and compete against a Ferrari. So let's get in tune with how we're made as humans and begin to order our lives accordingly and to operate ourselves in the world that way, so that we are enjoying life, we're productive in life, and we're deriving the contentment that's available to us in life that isn't dependent upon outward circumstances, but it's dependent upon us being willing to be in the pilot's seat and to drive this thing where we want to go. So that's the final ingredient in the brief recipe we're offering today, with no illusion that this is the whole kit and caboodle. We've just, delivered the final treatise on it, because we haven't. But I do think what we've talked about here can really help each of us crack the code on the contentment conundrum more than we have up until this point, in whatever way you need to. But before we close out, there's one thing I want to touch on that I think deserves attention, and that's simply, is there any value in discontentment, or is it simply something that we should be moving away from? And I want to propose that there's tremendous value in discontentment, and we shouldn't just try to get away from it. Because in our attempts to find contentment, we often ignore the important clues embedded in our discontentment that are pointing the way to contentment. Don't resist it, observe it, and learn from it. Because if we're willing, we can see discontentment not as the opposite of contentment, which we instinctively might think it is, but as a warning light on the dashboard of our life. I mean, if a warning light showed up on the dashboard of our car, we'd look into it to determine what the source of the problem was. Then we'd take steps to fix it. When discontentment shows up, we can treat it like a warning light on the dashboard of our life and look at it to determine its source and then take steps to fix it. You can look back at this ingredient list if you're choosing to buy into what we're sharing with you today and go, wonder which of one of those 5 lists on that short version of the recipe for contentment in life is either not present in adequate quantities or just not present at all, and kind of run a diagnostic on ourselves and get the recipe in better shape.
And if you ignore that discontentment for too long, that warning light, it can burn up the engine, it can break down the vehicle, it can bring a screeching halt to your life.
And then you're dealing with a whole separate set of problems. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of those fumbles can't be recovered. You've lost a marriage or 2. You've got a broken relationship with a kid that could have been yours to mend.
Lost a job or career path that you were working towards.
Or you stayed in a career path that was not in accordance or in alignment with how you're made and what you're made to do in the world. And you're angry at yourself for that, and your anger comes out at your spouse, your partner. It's coming out at your kids. You're coping poorly by eating too much, drinking too much, exercising too much, you name it. And guess what? Been there, done that. And I can 100% say with 100% confidence from my own experience that there is a way off of that path and onto the path that was uniquely made for you. And then finally, this is Andrew Petty is Dying. That's the name of the podcast. And we are tapping into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. So what's mortality's role in all of this? And I would say simply that, mortality really cuts through the BS. It cuts through our pettiness. It cuts through our wimpiness. It cuts through our pity parties and just applies a really useful pressure that motivates us to summon the courage and the resolve to do today what we keep putting off until tomorrow. And this podcast is not meant to provide, to instill in us the fear of impending and inevitable death and to cause us to get all white knuckly and bound up. This podcast is intended to help us courageously turn and face our mortality, see it for what it is, see that it's inevitable, and then allow it to fill the sails of our life with a good pressure that keeps us moving forward. So mortality's got a big role to play in this. So if you're listening to this and some of this stuff is landing well with you and you're like, gosh, yeah, I'm seeing that. I've been looking for contentment for its own sake and really failing to just live my life. Keep this mortality piece in mind and figure out, okay, what could I do today with what I've heard, with the part that stuck out to me? Because I've got today. I don't know about tomorrow, but I've got today. And convert whatever insight or insights you're having by listening to this conversation and participating in it in your own heart and mind into some tangible action today. Just one thing, one small thing. Make a phone call to a friend. Write a letter to a parent or a loved one. Hire a coach like me, and I'm shamelessly and unapologetically promoting my services because they work, not because I'm magical, but because these kinds of partnerships work. And join a graveyard group. Do something. But for Pete's sake, don't do nothing. Don't stay stuck. Get moving. And that concludes this conversation. Honey, any other final thoughts coming up that would help close it out? No pressure at all. Seriously. I seriously mean that, but just don't want to close out without hearing from you.
Well, maybe like we were talking before that I'm going to die. I'm not dead yet. Those around me are going to die, but they're not dead yet. So live each day with those who are still here with you, knowing that we don't know when the last one will be.
That'll preach. I'm glad you decided to spend time with me this morning doing this. Thanks.
Thanks for inviting me.
You got it. Okay. Hey, remember, you are going to die, but you're not dead yet. So get after it. So if you're seeking more contentment, first, stop looking for it. Then commit instead to living the life you were made to live and becoming the person you were made to be. Pay attention to the discontentment indicators on the dashboard of your life. What system malfunction is it alerting you to? Check the recipe of your life. Which ingredient in the recipe for becoming the person you were made to be and living the life you were made to live isn't there in sufficient measure or is absent altogether? And as you discover and travel your unique path in life with greater guts, gusto, abandon, and purpose, you'll start to notice the presence of a very welcome and pleasant companion. Contentment. Contentment that's not dependent on fickle circumstances. Contentment that's rugged and durable and up to you. All right. That's a wrap for today. I hope this episode has equipped you to crack the code on the contentment conundrum in your own life. Remember, you are going to die, but you're not dead yet, so get after it. With mortality as our motivator, this podcast exists to help you cultivate the mindset and the means to live the life you're made to live with guts, gusto, and abandon. That's my purpose as a coach, too. Connect with me on Facebook at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@digdeepwinbig.com. To learn about Graveyard Group Masterminds, where we make time each week to invest in your life's most important work, visit digdeepwinbig.com/The Graveyard Group. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.